Prime Minister Netanyahu was halfway through his speech at the United Nations when he took a jab at Britain, mocking its traditions, its legacy, and even its military presence. A few delegates nodded in agreement, some chuckled quietly, but then, something unexpected happened. A man stood up from the UK delegation, not a politician, not a diplomat, but a royal guard, someone who had never spoken publicly until that moment, and when he did, he didn't shout, he didn't need to, he delivered a calm, final warning to the Prime Minister of Israel right there. On the floor of the UNDOT, within minutes, the entire session was brought to a halt. Over 200 nations were left stunned. The official broadcast feed was cut. So, what did he say that brought a world leader to silence? Before we reveal the words that changed everything, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning of September 23rd began like any other at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The familiar hum of diplomatic machinery filled the corridors as delegates from 193 nations prepared for what was expected to be another routine session of the General Assembly. Coffee vendors worked their usual spots, security personnel conducted their standard sweeps, and translators tested their equipment in the familiar cacophony of international discourse. Among the sea of suits and briefcases stood a figure that commanded attention without seeking it. Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart of the British Royal Guard stood at his designated position near the UK delegation, his scarlet tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his ceremonial sword gleaming under the Assembly Hall's lights. At 42 years old, Lockhart had served in the Royal Guard for 8 years, but his military career stretched back to decades, including tours in Afghanistan and Iraq that had left invisible scars on a man who now stood as a symbol of British tradition and military precision. The delegates filed in with the usual pre-session chatter. French diplomats discussed trade agreements in hushed tones, while their German counterparts reviewed notes on climate initiatives. The American delegation, always commanding attention, took their seats with the practiced efficiency of a nation accustomed to being watched. But it was the arrival of the Israeli delegation that caused the first ripple of tension in the room. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu entered with his characteristic confidence, flanked by security personnel and advisors. His reputation preceded him, a skilled orator known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Middle Eastern politics for decades. Today, however, something in his demeanor suggested he was prepared for confrontation rather than diplomacy. As Netanyahu took his position at the podium, Lockhart remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead in the practiced stance of a ceremonial guard. Yet beneath that stoic exterior, the trained soldier was processing everything: the subtle shifts in body language, the nervous energy of certain delegates, the way Netanyahu's security details seemed more alert than usual. These were the instincts of a man who had spent years in combat zones, where reading a room could mean the difference between life and death. The session began with the usual procedural announcements, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Netanyahu was scheduled to address the assembly on the topic of regional security, but rumors had circulated that he intended to broaden his remarks to include criticisms of what he perceived as the ceremonial nature of international peacekeeping efforts. As the preliminary speakers concluded their remarks, the Secretary-General introduced Netanyahu with the formal courtesy reserved for heads of state. The Prime Minister approached the podium with measured steps, his eyes scanning the assembly, with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime in the spotlight. The hall fell silent, save for the soft whir of cameras and the occasional rustle of paper. Netanyahu began his speech in the traditional manner, acknowledging the Secretary-General and expressing Israel's commitment to international cooperation. But those who knew him well could sense the shift in his tone as he moved away from prepared remarks and into more personal territory. His voice carried the edge of a man who had grown weary of diplomatic niceties and was prepared to speak uncomfortable truths as he saw them. The Prime Minister's words initially focused on the challenges facing the Middle East, the complexity of regional conflicts, and the need for decisive action rather than endless debate. But as he warmed to his theme, his rhetoric began to take on a more pointed character. He spoke of the difference between real action and symbolic gestures, between genuine commitment and ceremonial displays. Lockhart continued to stand at attention, his face betraying nothing of the growing unease he felt as Netanyahu's speech took an increasingly provocative turn. The Royal Guard's training had taught him to remain impassive regardless of circumstances, but his combat experience had also taught him to recognize when a situation was deteriorating. The delegate beside him, a young attach from the British Embassy, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was then that Netanyahu made the comment that would shatter the carefully maintained decorum of the assembly. With a dismissive gesture toward the various ceremonial guards positioned throughout the hall, he declared, "We live in a world where real soldiers fight and die for their nations, while others play dress-up for tourists. Real soldiers don't stand still as statues for photographs, they act." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several delegates turned to look at the ceremonial guards, including Lockhart, who remained motionless despite the direct insult. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the room. The young British attach muttered under his breath, easy words from a man who's never worn a uniform, unaware that his comment had been heard by the one person in the room who had earned the right to respond. The insult was more than personal. It was an attack on the very concept of service that transcended national boundaries. Every ceremonial guard in that room had earned their position through years of military service, often including combat deployments that had tested their courage and commitment in ways that few politicians could understand. Netanyahu's words weren't just dismissive, they were deliberately provocative, designed to belittle the traditions and sacrifices of military personnel who had chosen to serve their nations in different capacities. As Netanyahu continued his speech, now emboldened by what he perceived as the silence of his targets, Lockhart found himself thinking of faces from his past. There was Private Johnson, barely 19 when he died in an IED explosion outside Helmand Province. It was Sergeant Rodriguez, a father of 3 who had been killed by a sniper while providing covering fire for his squad. There was Captain Williams, who had lost both legs to a roadside bomb, but had continued to serve until his injuries forced his retirement. These men had worn the same uniform that Lockhart now wore, had taken the same oath of service, had committed themselves to the same ideals of duty and honor. They had died not for glory or recognition, but for the simple belief that their service mattered, that their sacrifice meant something. And now, a politician who had never faced enemy fire was dismissing their memory as pageantry. The hall's atmosphere had grown thick with tension. Other delegates were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that Netanyahu's words had crossed a line that separated legitimate criticism from outright disrespect. The ceremonial guards from other nations, French, German, Italian all, remained at their posts, their discipline intact, but their eyes betrayed the same anger that was building in Lockhart's chest. Netanyahu, perhaps sensing the reaction to his words, doubled down on his criticism. "I see representatives of many nations here today," he continued, his voice rising with conviction, "and I wonder how many of them truly understand what it means to fight for survival. How many have made the hard choices that real leadership requires? We cannot afford to indulge in ceremonial gestures when our very existence is at stake." The Prime Minister's words were clearly directed at more than just the ceremonial guards. They were a broadside against the entire concept of diplomatic protocol, a challenge to the very institutions that had been created to prevent the kind of conflicts that had devastated the world in previous generations. But for Lockhart, there was something more personal. They were an assault on the memory of every soldier who had died, believing that their service, in whatever form it took, had meaning. The young British attach turned slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Lockhart's for just a moment. In that brief exchange, something passed between the man, understanding, a recognition of the insult that had been delivered not just to the guards in the room, but to the entire military tradition. They represented. The attach's earlier comment about Netanyahu never wearing a uniform had been more than idle criticism. It had been a recognition of the fundamental disconnect between political rhetoric and military reality. As Netanyahu prepared to conclude his remarks, seemingly satisfied with the reaction he had provoked, Lockhart made a decision that would alter the course of his life and career. The training that had kept him silent for 8 years of ceremonial duty was suddenly overwhelmed by the experience of 2 decades of military service, by the memory of fallen comrades, and by the simple recognition that some insults demanded a response. The decision to break protocol wasn't made in anger, though anger was certainly present. It was made with the same calculated precision that had served Lockhart well in combat, a recognition that sometimes the most important battles are fought, not with weapons, but with words, not on distant battlefields, but but in the halls of power where decisions are made that affect the lives of millions. As Netanyahu began to wrap up his speech, building to what he clearly intended as a triumphant conclusion, Lockhart took his first step forward. The movement was subtle at first, just a slight shift in position that might have gone unnoticed by most observers. But in the regimented world of ceremonial duty, even the smallest deviation from protocol was significant. The British ambassador, seated with the UK delegation, noticed the movement first. His eyes widened with alarm as he realized what was happening. Protocol dictated that ceremonial guards remain absolutely motionless throughout official proceedings, speaking only when directly addressed by their commanding officers. For a royal guard to move during a formal UN session was unprecedented. For him to speak would be unthinkable. But Lockhart was no longer thinking about protocol. He was thinking about Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had been killed by a mortar round while standing guard at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. Morrison had been a quiet man, devoted to his duty, who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments because he believed his service made a difference. He had died wearing the same uniform that Lockhart now wore, had taken the same oath of service, had committed himself to the same ideals of duty and honor that Netanyahu was now dismissing as meaningless pageantry. The second step was more decisive. Carrying Lockhart away from his assigned position and toward the center of the assembly hall. The movement created a ripple effect throughout the room as delegates began to notice the unprecedented breach of protocol. Cameras swung toward the figure in the scarlet tunic, while security personnel began to move with the practiced efficiency of professionals responding to an unexpected situation. Netanyahu, still speaking at the podium, hadn't yet noticed the commotion his words had caused. He was building to his conclusion, his voice rising with the passion of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. The world needs leaders who understand that strength comes not from ceremony, but from action, he declared, his words echoing through the hall's sound system. We cannot afford to indulge in theatrical displays when our survival depends on decisive action. The irony was not lost on Lockhart. Here was a man who had spent his entire career in the theater of politics, who had never faced the kind of life-and-death decisions that ordinary soldiers confronted daily, lecturing the assembly about the difference between theater and reality. The Prime Minister's words weren't just wrong. They were a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service meant, what ceremony represented, and what honor demanded. As Lockhart continued his slow, measured advance toward the podium, the hall's atmosphere shifted dramatically. The usual murmur of diplomatic conversation died away, replaced by a tension that was almost physical in its intensity. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a challenge to the very foundations of diplomatic immunity and ceremonial tradition. The moment when Netanyahu first noticed the approaching figure was captured by dozens of cameras and would later be replayed millions of times across social media platforms around the world. The Prime Minister's confident demeanor flickered for just an instant as he caught sight of the scarlet-clad figure moving through the assembly hall with the purposeful stride of a soldier advancing on an objective. For a brief moment, Netanyahu seemed uncertain whether to continue his speech or acknowledge the unprecedented interruption. His security detail was already moving, but they were constrained by the diplomatic protocols that governed their actions within the UN Assembly Hall. They could protect the Prime Minister from physical threats, but they couldn't simply attack a ceremonial guard from a friendly nation without creating an international incident. Lockhart's advance was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was the measured pace of a man who had made his decision and was committed to seeing it through regardless of the consequences. His years of military training had taught him the value of decisive action, and his experience in combat had shown him that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with principles. The Secretary General, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the situation, called for order, but his words seemed to dissolve into the electric atmosphere of the hall. Delegates were rising from their seats, some in alarm, others in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The media representatives were frantically adjusting their cameras, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would dominate headlines for days to come. As Lockhart approached the speaking area, Netanyahu finally stopped his speech. Entirely, the two men faced each other across the divide that separated the ceremonial from the political, the military from the civilian, the servant from the served. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither spoke. The entire assembly hall held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. It was then that Lockhart spoke, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had earned the right to be heard through years of service and sacrifice. "With respect, Mr. Prime Minister," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, "you are mistaken." The gasps that rippled through the assembly were audible, even over the sound system. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a direct challenge to a head of state by a ceremonial guard, something that had never happened in the history of the United Nations. The ramifications were immediate and far-reaching, but Lockhart was far from finished. Netanyahu's face darkened with a mixture of surprise and anger. He had been interrupted before, by protesters, by hecklers, by political opponents, but never by someone who was supposed to be part of the ceremonial backdrop of diplomatic proceedings. The Prime Minister's first instinct was to dismiss the interruption, to treat it as the action of a rogue individual who had overstepped his bounds. But there was something in Lockhart's bearing, in the way he stood with the confidence of a man who had faced death and emerged stronger, that prevented Netanyahu from simply brushing aside the challenge. This wasn't a protester or a heckler. This was a soldier, a representative of the military tradition that Netanyahu had just spent 10 minutes dismissing as meaningless pageantry. The silence that followed Lockhart's initial words was pregnant with possibilities. The royal guard stood at attention, his posture perfect despite the unprecedented nature of his actions. His eyes never left Netanyahu's face, and in that steady gaze was the accumulated weight of 2 decades of military service, the memory of fallen comrades, and the quiet dignity of a man who had chosen to serve his country in whatever capacity was required. Netanyahu, recovering from his initial surprise, attempted to regain control of the situation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying a tone of dismissive authority, "but I don't believe ceremonial guards are authorized to interrupt official proceedings. Perhaps you should return to your post." The words were clearly intended to put Lockhart in his place, to remind him of the hierarchy that governed diplomatic proceedings, but they also revealed the fundamental disconnect between Netanyahu's perception of military service and the reality of what men like Lockhart represented. The Prime Minister saw only the ceremony, the pageantry, the visible symbols of military tradition. He couldn't see the years of training, the combat experience, the sacrifices that had earned these men the right to wear their uniforms with pride. Lockhart's response was measured and precise, delivered with the same calm authority he had used to brief his troops before dangerous missions. "I have stood guard at the coffins of men who died for the idea of duty," he said, his words carrying across the silent assembly hall. "I have served in wars that your bodyguards would flee from. Do not confuse ceremony with weakness." The impact of these words was immediate and profound. This wasn't just a ceremonial guard speaking out of turn. This was a combat veteran, a man who had earned his position through years of service that included the kind of experiences that few politicians could even imagine. The scarlet tunic and bearskin hat weren't just costumes, they were symbols of a military tradition that stretched back centuries, earned through blood and sacrifice. Netanyahu's security detail shifted nervously, unsure of how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios, but not for a confrontation between their principal and a ceremonial guard from a friendly nation. The diplomatic implications were staggering. Any physical intervention could create an international incident that would overshadow whatever political points Netanyahu hoped to make with his speech. The Prime Minister, perhaps recognizing that his dismissive approach had backfired, attempted to regain the initiative. "I'm sure you're a fine soldier," he said, his tone now carrying a note of condescension that was clearly intended to diffuse the situation while maintaining his authority. "But this is neither the time nor the place for such displays." But Lockhart was not to be deterred. His response came with the precision of a man who had spent years learning to communicate clearly under pressure. "You speak of real soldiers," he said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I have buried real soldiers. Boys who will never see their families again because they believed in something greater than themselves." The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Here was a man who had not only served his country in combat, but had also performed the most solemn duty that any soldier could be asked to perform, honoring the dead, standing vigil over the fallen, carrying the memories of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The ceremony that Netanyahu had dismissed as meaningless pageantry suddenly took on a different character when viewed through the lens of actual military experience. The transformation in the Assembly Hall's atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as a routine diplomatic session had become something far more significant, a confrontation between two fundamentally different worldviews, two opposing concepts of what service meant and what honor demanded. The delegates were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses to a moment that would define how military service was perceived in the halls of international diplomacy. Lockhart's words about burying real soldiers had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the immediate confrontation. With Netanyahu, in the audience were representatives from nations that had lost thousands of their own military personnel in conflicts around the world. The French delegation remembered their losses in Mali and Afghanistan. The German representatives thought of their casualties in various peacekeeping missions. The American delegation, perhaps more than any other, understood the weight of military sacrifice that Lockhart was invoking. But it was Lockhart's next words that would transform this confrontation from a diplomatic incident into a defining moment of moral clarity. His voice, which had remained steady throughout the exchange, suddenly dropped to a tone that was somehow both quieter and more powerful than anything that had come before. "So when you mock the uniform, Mr. Prime Minister," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "you mock the dead." The silence that followed was not the polite quiet of diplomatic proceedings, but the profound hush of a room full of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just a ceremonial guard speaking out of turn. This was a voice for every soldier who had ever died, believing that their service mattered, that their sacrifice meant something, that their memory would be honored by those who came after them. Netanyahu's face had gone through a series of changes during this exchange: surprise, anger, disputiveness, and now something that might have been recognition of the gravity of what was happening. The Prime Minister was an experienced politician, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy for decades. He understood that this moment had the potential to define not just his speech, but his entire approach to military and diplomatic relations. The Assembly Hall erupted in a cacophony of responses. Some delegates rose to their feet in applause, recognizing the moral courage it had taken for Lockhart to speak truth to power. Others looked horrified at the breach of protocol, concerned about the precedent being set for future diplomatic proceedings. The media representatives were frantically capturing every moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. Netanyahu's security detail finally moved into action, but their approach was careful and measured. They couldn't simply remove Lockhart by force without creating an international incident, but they also couldn't allow the situation to escalate further. The diplomatic implications were staggering. The action of a single ceremonial guard had the potential to affect relations between nations, to influence public opinion about military service, and to reshape the conversation about the relationship between political leadership and military sacrifice. The Secretary General, recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond anything covered in UN protocols, called for an immediate adjournment of the session. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. In the space of a few minutes, Lockhart had accomplished something that months of diplomatic negotiations had failed to achieve. He had forced a fundamental conversation about the nature of service, the meaning of honor, and the respect owed to those who had chosen to serve their countries in uniform. As the session was officially adjourned, the Assembly Hall devolved into chaos. Delegates clustered in small groups, discussing the unprecedented events they had just witnessed. Some were clearly supportive of Lockhart's actions, viewing them as a necessary response to Netanyahu's provocative comments. Others were concerned about the breakdown of diplomatic protocol and the potential implications for future international meetings. Netanyahu, flanked by his security detail, made his way toward the exit with the practiced efficiency of a politician who had learned to navigate hostile environments. But his usual confidence seemed shaken by the encounter with Lockhart. The Prime Minister had built his career on his ability to control narratives, to shape public opinion through carefully crafted rhetoric. The idea that a ceremonial guard could append his carefully planned speech with a few simple words was clearly troubling to him. As Netanyahu passed near the British delegation, he made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is a disgrace," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard by nearby delegates and media representatives. "A complete breakdown of diplomatic protocol. The British government should be ashamed of allowing such behavior from their representatives." But the words sounded hollow after Lockhart's powerful rebuke. The Prime Minister's attempt to frame the incident as a breach of protocol rather than a legitimate response to his own provocative comments revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. He had attacked the honor of military personnel and been answered by someone who had earned the right to defend that honor through years of service and sacrifice. Lockhart, meanwhile, was being approached by British diplomatic personnel who were clearly struggling to balance their responsibility to maintain protocol with their recognition of the moral authority behind his actions. The Royal Guard's breach of diplomatic custom was unprecedented, but his words had resonated with a truth that transcended the normal rules of international relations. The young British attaché, who had made the comment about Netanyahu never wearing a uniform, approached Lockhart with obvious admiration. "Sir," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what you did in there needed to be said. Thank you for having the courage to say it." Similar expressions of support came from unexpected quarters. A French military attaché, himself a veteran of overseas deployments, offered a subtle nod of respect. A German diplomat, whose own country had grappled with questions of military honor and civilian oversight, approached to express his appreciation for Lockhart's words. Even members of the American delegation, bound by their own diplomatic constraints, found ways to communicate their support for the message, if not the method. But perhaps the most significant response came from the other ceremonial guards in the hall. The French Republican Guard, the Italian Carabinieri, the German Honor Guard all had remained at their posts throughout the confrontation, bound by the same protocols that Lockhart had chosen to break. But their eyes told a different story. In their steady gazes was recognition of the courage it had taken to speak for all of them, to give voice to the frustration and anger that they had been forced to contain. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, video clips of the confrontation were being shared across social media platforms around the world. The hashtag #RoyalGuardSpeaks began trending globally, with millions of users sharing their own thoughts about military service, ceremonial duties, and the respect owed to those who had chosen to serve their countries in uniform. The aftermath of the confrontation extended far beyond the walls of the UN Assembly Hall. News organizations around the world led with the story, recognizing that Lockhart's actions had tapped into broader conversations about military service, political leadership, and the relationship between those who serve and those who govern. Military veterans organizations were among the first to respond, with statements of support pouring in from groups representing soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines from dozens of countries. The American Legion, the Royal British Legion, veterans of foreign wars, and similar organizations issued statements praising Lockhart's courage in defending the honor of military service. These weren't just ceremonial endorsements. They represented the voices of millions of veterans who had served their countries in conflicts around the world. The response from active military personnel was more measured, constrained by the professional obligations that prevented serving members from making political statements, but in private conversations, in social media posts carefully worded to avoid official sanction, and in the subtle gestures of support that characterize military culture, the message was clear. Lockhart had spoken for all of them. The political implications were equally significant. Netanyahu's office issued a statement expressing disappointment at the breach of diplomatic protocol. While carefully avoiding any direct criticism of Lockhart's service record, the Israeli Prime Minister's political opponents, however, were quick to seize on the incident as evidence of his divisive approach to international relations. The British government found itself in a delicate position. On one hand, Lockhart's actions had clearly violated diplomatic protocol and created an international incident. On the other hand, his words had resonated with the truth about military service that transcended national boundaries. The official response was carefully calibrated to acknowledge the seriousness of the protocol breach, while recognizing the legitimate concerns that had motivated Lockhart's actions. Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons that week featured heated exchanges about the incident, with opposition MPs demanding to know why a serving member of the Royal Guard had been placed in a position where he felt compelled to break protocol. The government's response emphasized the importance of both diplomatic protocol and the honor of military service, a delicate balance that satisfied no one completely but avoided further inflaming the situation. The most significant response, however, came from an unexpected source. Military personnel from around the world began sharing their own stories of service, their own experiences of being dismissed as mere ceremonial figures, their own frustrations with political leaders who seemed to view military service as a photo opportunity rather than a sacred trust. The conversation that Lockhart had sparked extended far beyond the immediate confrontation with Netanyahu to encompass broader questions about the relationship between military and civilian leadership. Veterans groups organized rallies in support of Lockhart, with events taking place in London, New York, Washington, and dozens of other cities. These weren't political demonstrations in the traditional sense, but rather expressions of solidarity with a fellow veteran who had chosen to speak truth to power at great personal cost. The most powerful responses came from the families of fallen soldiers. Parents who had lost sons and daughters in military service spoke about the comfort they found in ceremonial honors, the importance of traditions that honored their children's sacrifice, and their gratitude to Lockhart for defending the dignity of military service. These weren't political statements. They were expressions of grief and pride that transcended national boundaries and political affiliations. In the days that followed the confrontation, Lockhart returned to his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his service throughout his career. He gave no interviews, issued no statements, and made no attempt to capitalize on the global attention his actions had generated. For him, the incident had been a moment of moral clarity, a recognition that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. The Royal Guard resumed his position at various ceremonial functions, standing with the same rigid discipline that had marked his service before the UN incident. But something had changed. When tourists now took photographs of the ceremonial guards, when children pointed at their colorful uniforms, when dignitaries passed by with casual indifference, there was a different quality to the attention. The world now saw these figures, not as silent statues or tourist attractions, but as representatives of a military tradition that had earned respect through service and sacrifice. The impact on Netanyahu's reputation was more complex. While his supporters continued to defend his right to criticize what they saw as outdated military ceremonialism, the confrontation with Lockhart had exposed a fundamental disconnect between his rhetoric and the reality of military service. Opinion polls showed a decline in his approval ratings, particularly among military families and veterans organizations. More significantly, the incident had changed the conversation about military service in the modern world. Military historians noted that Lockhart's actions represented a unique moment in the relationship between military and civilian leadership, a reminder that the men and women who serve in uniform are not merely symbols or props for political theater, but individuals who have committed themselves to ideals that transcend political convenience. The UN itself initiated a review of protocols governing ceremonial personnel at international gatherings, while the review ultimately concluded that such breaches of protocol could not be tolerated. It also recommended enhanced respect for the military traditions represented by ceremonial guards and better communication between diplomatic and military personnel to prevent future misunderstandings. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the confrontation was on the young soldiers who witnessed it, either in person or through the extensive media coverage that followed. For a generation of military personnel who had grown up in an era of increasingly complex relationships between military and civilian leadership, Lockhart's actions provided a powerful example of moral courage and professional integrity. The incident also sparked academic discussions about the role of ceremony in modern military culture, the relationship between tradition and effectiveness, and the importance of maintaining respect for military service in democratic societies. Military colleges and academies around the world incorporated the confrontation into their curricula, using it as a case study in leadership, ethics, and the proper relationship between military and civilian authority. As the months passed, the immediate controversy faded, but the deeper questions raised by Lockhart's actions continued to resonate. The Royal Guard had returned to his silent vigil, but his words had given voice to the experiences and frustrations of military personnel around the world. In a few brief moments, he had reminded the world that behind every uniform, every ceremony, every tradition, stood real people who had chosen to serve their countries with honor and dignity. The confrontation between Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It had forced a global conversation about the nature of service, the meaning of honor, and the respect owed to those who choose to serve their countries in uniform. Most importantly, It had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not by those who speak for a living, but by those who serve in silence until conscience demands that they speak. In the end, Lockhart's actions had achieved something that no diplomatic protocol or international treaty could accomplish. They had reminded the world that military service, in all its forms, represents a sacred trust between those who serve and those who are served, a trust that transcends political boundaries and demands the highest respect from those who benefit from its protection.